Despite what younger, dumber Daniel here on the channel was saying, I actually have a lot of respect for the YA genre. The more I have read deeper into it and learned its history, it's so foundational to the long-term success of fantasy as a whole. Let's be honest, if most of us are looking back to the first reads that got us into reading the sci-fi fantasy epics we're addicted to today, it usually starts in YA. Before I was reading Wheel of Time, my dad was reading me Harry Potter and his Dark Materials, and then I went on to pick up those series on my own as I got older. And as YA goes, those influences will typically trickle up to the fantasy genre as the readers who are brought up with it grow up a bit. Not always, and the fantasy genre outside of the YA space tends to follow trends less aggressively than its younger counterpart does. We are all aware of how much something like Hunger Games can just change the space for a minute before it flips to having a different kind of, oh, this is the major success. But that exists in all genres at all levels. I just think it's a bit stronger in the YA space. I say all of this to just kind of emphasize that when I start looking at a YA book, I don't try and judge it any differently than one geared towards adults, especially if it makes it clear from go that it's trying to captivate both adult and younger readers. I would say his Dark Materials, Narnia, many other books, even Hunger Games, fall into that category where they can be easily both enjoyable for adults and younger readers. And that's because they're willing to get into complex themes, they're willing to actually have higher stakes, be a bit more brutal, scary, all things that I actually think younger readers should be exposed to in their media, especially when it comes to books. It's good for a kid to be scared by a book, in my mind, especially before they start getting scared by movies or TV shows or whatever the hell they're gonna stumble across on the internet. It builds up that feeling in you, that tension release, and like the most safe and controlled environment. There's no jump scares. It's a very you continue to read, you control it kind of fear. Now, why am I talking about this? The Old Kingdom by Garth was released in 1995, just 2 years before Harry Potter's smash success in 1997. And comparing it to Harry Potter, well, obviously Harry Potter is a success and on the level it is for a reason, kind of encapsulates why it frustrates me specifically how so many people still to this day kind of view YA as a whole as non-challenging to the readers, as especially earlier on Harry Potter was. Don't get me wrong, Harry Potter has its horror sequences, it has its themes, but it's not really willing to challenge a younger reader. The Old Kingdom kind of thrives in that. Before we get much deeper into it, I do want to clarify, I read the original Old Kingdom trilogy, at least that's what I've seen fans refer to it as. Since then, there's been additional prequels and interquels and further on sequels that are not as well reviewed, but the first Old Kingdom book is Sabriel, and it's absolutely a standalone that can be just enjoyed on its own, but there is a sequel and a third book, Lirael and Abhorsen, that continue that story, but have a very definitive end to them. And one day I hope to pick up the next two. I just wanted to get my thoughts out on this original trilogy. And what this story is about is so classical epic fantasy, and it really warms my heart to see YA series that are willing to lean so heavily into being an epic fantasy in all senses of the label. Because children, especially younger ones in my mind, can absolutely handle that. Not just when it comes to the world building and the magic systems, but part of the requirements, in my opinion, for being truly epic fantasy is willing to take on big, meaty themes, to use your girthy page counts to dissect topics and issues and instill messages in the reader. And beyond just being truly epic fantasy, the Old Kingdom, especially for its time, is pretty inventive and boundary pushing for what epic fantasy could be, involving trains and guns, right alongside necromancy and two dueling magic systems that are all reflective of the wider story Garth is trying to tell, while also not reflecting the modern trend for YA and its obsession with dystopias and saying like governments are bad. No, Garth actually has our characters being a part of a very flawed institution, one that is just as flawed as themselves, but it doesn't necessarily deserve to be burned down or taken to the ground, and we need the Chosen One to raise a new government or something along those lines. Instead, the Chosen Ones are asked more just to assume the mantle, the pressure of true leadership, all while embracing who they truly are, which might seem like a YA trend, but I think we've all become more aware of how in society it's hard to really be yourself. And some of the things that Garth Nix communicated here still resonated with me as a 30-year-old man struggling to, actually be myself with an audience online versus putting on a character. And that's kind of one of the big things that our characters, Sabriel and Lirael, have to deal with. But all right, the actual story. We follow two different worlds. In the south, we have Enceltier, which is a society that has much more modern technology. But in the north is the Old Kingdom. And there are two opposing magical forces that exist throughout this world. One that is more evil, the free magic, and another that is neutral, charter magic. And reminiscent of A Song of Ice and Fire, there is actually an ancient wall that separates these two countries. In the south, the government we follow maintains a military post that monitors and prevents any free magic from crossing the border. And this is where our Chosen One trope comes in. The free magic that is corrosive and evil and bad is actually something that our Chosen One, Sabriel, can wield. So she has access to both the charter magics and the free magics. And this becomes representative of kind of the two identities we all struggle within ourselves in my mind. And the ability to actually step into that corrosive magic is Sabriel's ability to reconcile the two minds in herself, the responsibilities that do not erode her away. Because power is corrupting, this power is handed to her, free magic is corrupting, which is also handed to her, and she must maintain both. And a trope that I know is controversial, some people hate it, some people love it. This is a royal bloodline Chosen One trope, and I actually really like when books have generational change, and that is what Lirael picks up with the second book.
All right, sorry, I need my whiteboard for this part. What makes this world really cool and start to work on like that next independent epic fantasy level is you have tech working in this side of the wall and free magic and charter magic working freely on the northern side of the wall. But if you get close enough to the wall on this side before technology starts to break down, which is also a thing, the charter magic begins to work. So people near the wall actually are aware of charter magic, while those much further down south are kind of like, pfft, that's not real. Like you actually see in Wheel of Time where people super far from like the White Tower are like, Trollocs are fake. And what makes the Abhorsen, or the Chosen One, inherited through a bloodline special, is they inherit the duty to maintain the balance between life and death. And they are able to combine these two forms of magic through their bell tool, which if you read the series, you'll read all about that, to control the dead. Yes. This is a story where the good guys are involved in necromancy because they're special. Now, the big question as to what causes this divide where magic actually begins to break down this way and then tech starts to break down that way is, if I'm reading this right, these are two different planes of existence that happen to be connected here. Once you travel to the other side, like even I think the stars are different. And so like, oh, this is just a wall that separates two parallel realities. And the Abhorsen and their like special lot, because there's a group of special people in this, balance on both sides. But the real big threats and danger do come typically from up here in terms of like the evil overlord. Bah! I'm so good at communicating on whiteboards.
That was sarcasm.
And I know some people hate when I do this, but I just have to let you know, those special bells that the Abhorsen uses, which by the way, is not always directly in the bloodline inherited. Sometimes it's like a niece or a nephew, but the bells they use, I just pictured member berries from South Park. I have absolutely no idea why, but I just pictured them being shaken every time. And that's because I'm stupid.
Yeah, remember Alex? Remember?
But I cannot stress enough how much more there is to the magic system than just having these like symbol-based charter magic and this more corrosive free magic, because we also have these gigantic necromancer threats that, in my favorite utilization of a mustache-twirling villain, kind of exist as these ethereal threats that you feel permeating the page, but what our heroes have to deal with day to day, you know, chapter to chapter, is more a mixture of the flaws within themselves, their own mistakes, well, having having just, you know, people around them screw up. There's actually even a pro/antagonist named Nicholas in the second and third book that is a real challenge for people to deal with, and unlike what many YA stories would just kind of put him on an easy, simple redemption arc, it does not go that well for Nicholas. And even our character in the second book, Lirael, the first half of the book, which I would argue is kind of like a whole separate book than the second half, with even the time jump that happens here as well, it's just about how she screws up. She's overly ambitious, and she ends up making a mistake that could cost people so dearly. But in the process, she also gets an animal companion that I adore, called the Disreputable Dog. And kind of in a fun character choice from Garth Nix, both Sabriel and Lirael and Sam and Nicholas, they are the most believable kids you will ever read in an epic fantasy. It's such a great choice to have these kids be absurdly human. The most relatable YA character I have come across since probably Lyra in His Dark Materials. Quick side note, if you love His Dark Materials, I'm willing to bet money you will love the Old Kingdom. In terms of its presentation and style, these should be considered like sister series in my head. But like, Lirael suffers from depression, and it's very overt, and as someone who had a little bit of depression as a kid, the way she thinks of it and the way Garth Nix presents her internal struggles, especially as she continues to go down the line of higher responsibilities and taking on these bigger threats, feels so accurate. Same thing with Nicholas and Sam. God, there's even a character who suffers for like 200 years that's picked up, and the reflection of how that's affected them mentally I find both hilarious in the most dark, horrible way. And we also have a mischievous cat character who, if you're kind of put off by the fact of these more like reserved yet mental health suffering heavy protagonists, it's the animal companions, including the cat and the dog, that inject a lot of the over-the-top smarmy personality that'll just win anybody over. Like, they are of those actually it's Tim Curry narrated, but they have that like Tim Curry smarminess that's just, oh, they are giving sass and condescending and teaching lessons, all while being these free spirits captured within dogs. And again, maybe my favorite animal companions I've seen in YA since I read His Dark Materials, and I might like them more than Pan. Say what you will about Pan, doesn't have the most personality. And if I had to summarize the general tone and world presentation you find throughout all of the Old Kingdom, to me it's very Alice in Wonderland meets His Dark Materials. But getting further into the magic system, as I mentioned, there is necromancy consistently throughout this. In fact, the main responsibility that Sabriel is having to inherit deals with death, and I'm not going to spoil it beyond that, but if I had a kid who was getting to the age where they were starting to ask questions about death and what happens afterward, I would, one, obviously have informative conversations with them that are true and et cetera, but I'd also give them this book, because I think once a child's at that age, what Garth Nix managed to handle here is an imaginative, wondrous look at how horrifying yet peaceful death can be, both the evil and the necessity of it. Garth Nix looks at death so accurately through both an adult and youthful lens, and communicates these heavy ideas in a way where it's like, a kid can't understand that when the sun explodes, yes, it'll destroy Earth, but you don't have to worry about that. To me, the way he took one of the most horrifying things a kid's gonna have to come to terms with as they grow older, dying, and made it somehow accessible. Like, oh yes, there are characters that die. There are serious consequences. There's brutal sequences throughout this, and genuinely scary ones, even for me as an adult. But there's always a lesson, a presentation, something. They just started mowing, and I don't know how much that's going to interrupt. I'm gonna go inside real quick. It was just so pretty outside.
I'm so very sorry about that, y'all. That's gonna be distracting as hell in this video. Let's get back into it. Boiling down what I was trying to say about the magic system, it amplifies the darkness of the series, while also providing a pathway for young and old readers alike to cope with ideas presented heavily and almost without mercy from Garth Nix in the text around not just death, but exploitation and so much more. Grief, trauma, loss, shock. There's even a refugee crisis central to this story that yeah, the kids need to deal with and understand. And the government isn't just some horrible nihilistic force that's going to do its worst, and instead is actually trying to help people, despite the evil side, yes, trying to use these people as a source of fear, chaos, disruption, and eventually, hopefully, the end goal of the bad, corruption. And that's what I'm getting at. It's a good kingdom that's just filled with people with faults. And so the conflict isn't dependent on, oh, dumb decisions that aren't even believable. And I would say almost everyone is either believably naive because they're young, or they're just making a mistake we all could fall for. And this is going to take me to talking about the structure of the story. And it could be where my one kind of big criticism does come in. Because while I adore that these younger characters aren't even having to be told it's okay to ask for help, and, they will just do it. So like so much on the character world level is just clicking with me. The structure here is reflective, I believe, of Garth Nix not really expecting his reader to want much of a structure or be familiar with how a story should feel. Sabriel is the best structured of the three books, no doubt, but the two after, Lirael and Abhorsen, very much so not, at least not in a traditional structure that will feel comfortable, which could be a good thing for some readers, but Lirael is essentially two books combined into one, and it very much so feels like that. And then Abhorsen, it actually suffers from like too much of a Sanderlanche at the end. There is a climax to this trilogy that lasts for so long that despite the action being great and a lot of the emotion with the characters happening and the loss and the actual brutality of what's being done consistently landing, I got exhausted by it. Truly by the end of the third book, while I was like tearing up with some things that were going on with their characters, I was also like, okay, this just enough action, please. Fortunately for me, this is made up for. I like that Garth Nix was willing to go, hey, it's my fantasy world, and despite it being inspired from a time where sexism exists, screw that. Here, I want all kids to feel like there is the most potential. And while I'm going to make them have to deal with all these darker themes, let's let that just not exist in our magical fun time, which I totally understand how many authors feel like, hey, sexism's a thing in the past, I'm gonna bring it in my book. I am not even really criticizing that. I think if you handle it right, it can be a boon to your story. But its absence, especially if you're going for a younger audience, can also be a boon. It just totally depends on the intent from the author, and I feel like Garth Nix's intent is appreciated. And I never thought I'd really say this. Typically, I hate all romance and YA books, but here, it's so darkly adorable and like frankly handled from the perspective of kids that one, it does feel like how when you were young and had a crush, like the thought process goes, which is like, cute, we're together, are we? Kiss, like, I don't know, that's what it was like when you're a child, that I ended up being invested in it. And it's because Garth Nix actually took the time to make sure these personalities, despite how reserved they are, do click, especially with their contradictions. At the end of the day, I'm just thrilled to have come across another YA series that goes against so many of my preconceptions that I used to hold about this genre and delivers a story that I think would be great for children to read. I think it will challenge them. I think it'll make their brain realize stuff that consciously they might not even. It's something they can come back to as an adult and still hold up and enjoy. The themes are dark and Garth Nix pulls zero punches, but he has the follow-through intact as an author to make the messaging land. And while he's going to expose a young audience to death and extortion and all this stuff, he presents it in a way where it's understandable. The counters to it are something that even a child could relate to in the text, and even like systemic issues within the kingdom that is the good guys are addressed and brought to the forefront. The only like criticism you could have if you're kind of being a is saying like, well, he has like a chosen bloodline, so therefore the monarchy is enforced and good. What, like, it's fantasy. Are you gonna say Aragorn's the bad guy for taking over as the king of Gondor? Fuck off. Probably shouldn't say fuck when I'm talking about whatever. And the biggest question I'm left with is, how the hell has this never been adapted? It's a YA series that's popular, finished, well-reviewed, and even has like gaps of time between books, so taking a bit of a break and having the cast age isn't an issue. There's magic animals and like, What the hell, Hollywood? You are still milking Lord of the Rings 2.5 decades later, but the Old Kingdom was just nada? It's got a young, strong female protagonist with a great personality, a male protagonist along her side that does not feel talked down to or like the dumb guy. We have a great sense of humor, handling of mental health issues. It even feels like these last 5 years would have been like the perfect time to adapt. Is it because there's no mainstream gimmick like Hogwarts houses or demons in his dark I have no idea. It is insane to me that the Old Kingdom has not been brought to life, even in an animated format. But the Old Kingdom, at least to the way I interpret Garth Nix's darkly beautiful imagination, is the most Ghibli-esque movie that is a book fantasy epic for kids. This reminded me of something like Spirited Away, and if it was going to be adapted, that's the style I think would be best to realize this tone and humor and the visuals that Garth Nix paints with his elevated ass prose, mainly because I find that style of meticulously crafted, almost surgical imagination and creativity flows from beginning to end here. And this goes even beyond Sabriel, who's like low-hanging fruit for being a well-motivated badass character who's taking on spooky yet beautiful themes in the first book with like the spirit of her father being involved. Just fantastic, and all of that slides right in. But even in the second book, Lirael, we have her taking on, in that first half I mentioned, that is kind of very separate from the second half of the story, a monster that is released in the library, and it's her fault, yet the story of her taking it on proves how capable and I'm just going to put Cabell there, we're all going to deal with that, and motivated she is. And Ghibli is often heralded for their young, motivated, capable female characters that end up in these insane, otherworldly scenarios. All of this just fits with the studio, and I think would fit oh so naturally. Counterpoint, Ghibli does not always have the best record when it comes to adapting Western fantasy stories, though I would just consider that one a miss for reasons we don't have time to get into. But that is going to take me to ending this review with one of my favorite little songs, poems we come across in the text that explains a little bit about charter magic. The Old Kingdom for me, at least the first 3 books, the original trilogy, gets a 9 out of 10. After a few disappointing reads, it's wonderful to have something like this. Stay tuned for a Wandering Inn review coming soon. And now, let's end it. 5 great charters knit the land, together linked hand in hand. 1 in the people who wear the crown, 2 in the folk who keep the dead down. 3 and 5 became stone and mortar. 4 sees all in frozen water. Ooh, it's so good.